Hi, everyone. Welcome in. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jessica Owens, and I am a System of Care Specialist with the UC Davis Resource Center for Family Focused Practice. We are so grateful to have you all here in the room with us today. You are here for our July Complex Care webinar. So if you have joined us before for one of these webinars, welcome back. If this is your first one, welcome. We're glad to have you here with us today. Just want to take a moment to say to you all, happy Wednesday. Please go ahead and take a moment and introduce yourselves in the chat. Feel free to share who you are and what county or agency you represent. We always love to see who is in the room with us. And as folks are joining the call and getting connected to their audio, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with an icebreaker. So for those of you who have been in these webinars in the past, I will share that these webinars have been up and running since 2021, and today's webinar actually marks our 50th webinar in the Complex Care series. So there's a lot for us to celebrate today. So once again, as you all are getting logged on and connected to audio, I'm going to kick us off with an icebreaker. So since we are celebrating our 50th webinar today, I would like to hear from you all. What was the last thing you celebrated? And please feel free to go ahead and post that in the chat. And just reading the chat, I see we have some folks from Riverside. I see we have Victor in the house. Butte County is here. We also have the Sierra Native Alliance. Welcome. Glad to see you in the room. We have Nevada County. Oh, we have a few folks from Victor. Welcome, everyone. We got Madera, Los Angeles, Sacramento. I just wanted to share who all is in the room with us today. Now let's get back to the icebreaker question. So,
Hey, Jessica, can I share the last thing that I celebrated?
absolutely, please, Ben, come on in.
All right, so I have a 6 and a 9-year-old, two boys. So I have crazy boy energy in my house going on. And for the last couple of weekends, they've been really getting into riding their bicycles on the dirt track. And my 9-year-old made a successful jump off of one of the dirt ramps. So that was the last thing that I celebrated.
That's awesome. That's so fun. Oh my gosh, there's a little pump track in the town where I live, and I don't have any children, but I still enjoy watching them ride around. It's pretty impressive. So super fun. Thanks for sharing, Ben.
Absolutely.
So yeah, we have friends are in the audience who have been enjoying 4th of July celebrations. We've had weddings to celebrate recently, even a 26-year wedding anniversary. Looks like folks are celebrating a lot of birthdays. My birthday was about a month ago, so lots of things to celebrate. Ooh, someone in the audience got a new puppy. Congratulations on that. That's a lot of work, but oh, so fun. Very cool. Well, thanks everyone for sharing. We always love to see everyone's responses, and happy birthday to those of you who have been celebrating a birthday in the last few weeks. Okay, so we are also going to take a moment to get a better picture of who is in our audience. So we're also going to take this time to drop a poll. The first poll is related to the kind of organization you work for. And I'm going to have my colleague Alicia drop that poll really quick. Please go ahead and take a moment to complete that. And we'll keep the poll open for about 30 more seconds, so you still have time. And I can see the poll as you are all filling it out. And we have about 70% of the audience that have completed it so far. So thank you, thank you, thank you for your participation. And if it works better, if it's easier to post it in the chat, you can put it there as well. About 10 more seconds left for the poll. All right. Well, thank you everyone for taking a moment to fill that out. And Alicia, let's go ahead and close it out and take a look at the results. All right. Is everyone able to see the results of the poll? Yes, I see some heads nodding. So we have about 43% of the audience representing a county. So child welfare, probation, or a different county department. And 18% of our audience is made up of state departments. So maybe folks from CDSS, DHCS, the California Department of Education, etc. We also have about 18% of the audience are community-based organizations. And we have about 4% of the audience being represented by a tribe or tribal organization. And if, just going down the line here, we also have some folks from education, regional center, and some folks marked other. So please feel free to post in the chat if you did mark other. Tell us more about that. We want to make sure we are capturing the type of organization you represent. All right, Alicia, let's go ahead and do the poll for the role. So the next poll will be, what is your role? So within that organization, what kind of role do you have? Thank you, everyone. We are getting some good participation this morning. We appreciate that. Okay, and we'll keep it going for about 10 more seconds or so. We have about 90% of the audience who've completed the poll. So thank you, thank you, thank you, everyone. Great job this morning. And Alicia, let's go ahead and close out the poll and share the results. Okay, is everyone able to see the results of this poll? Okay, great. I see some heads nodding. So about 50% of this audience is in a leadership role. 14% are therapists or clinicians. We have 1% probation, 21% social workers, 20% case managers. We do have a caregiver in the room. We have some parent partners in the room. And we also have a youth or former youth in the audience with us today. So great to have you here. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being here with us today. And I think we can go ahead and stop sharing the results now that we've had a chance to get a clearer picture of who all is here in the audience. I see lots of celebrations still happening in the chat. People are saying hi to their friends and colleagues and helping them celebrate some birthdays. I love seeing that. Okay, so next, after this portion here, we're going to move on to just a few short housekeeping items. So I do have a few of my UC Davis colleagues in the house with me today. I have Alicia Delara and Geraldine Bordage from the UC Davis Resource Center for Family Focused Practice, and they're going to be helping me monitoring the chat and assisting with any tech issues that may come up. So I just want to let you know who your supports are. This presentation, as you know, is being recorded. The recording and a PDF of the PowerPoint will be posted on our Complex Care webinar, our website, and we'll make sure you all have the link for that. Geraldine just posted it in the chat, so you'll be able to use that link to go back and see the recording of this webinar, look at any of our past webinars, and also register for future webinars that are coming up. We will have an evaluation at the end of this presentation, so please, please, please stick around to provide us with your feedback. For any of you who are interested in making a child-specific complex care case coaching request, we also have a link for you to make that request. Geraldine will also put that link in the chat for you. And last but not least, if you were interested in a letter of attendance for being here at this webinar with us this morning, you can also make that request, and Geraldine just dropped that link in the chat for you. Okay, we are almost ready to begin. And before I introduce today's presenter, I just wanted to do some level setting with everyone in the audience and remind you all that when we use the term complex care, it is intended to highlight the circumstances in which youth have a variety of identified needs across multiple domains that have been unmet, often over long periods of time, by behavioral health, child welfare, probation, education, and other systems. As a result, these youth need high-intensity, individualized treatment options to better resolve challenges and address their needs. By integrating services from multiple systems and tailoring interventions to the specific needs of each youth, we are better able to provide comprehensive support and facilitate meaningful improvements in their lives. So, the title of today's presentation is Human Trafficking's Nexus and Impact on the Tribal Community. Native Americans have experienced victimization, oppression, and poverty, making them particularly susceptible to human trafficking. We know that tribal youth are disproportionately overrepresented in care. We also know that traffickers often target youth who are disconnected from their families, communities, and cultural identity. For our presenter today, I'm thrilled to introduce Ben Greer. He is a former Special Deputy Attorney General at the California Attorney General's Office. He was the lead member of the Attorney General's Human Trafficking Special Projects Team. He is currently a senior instructor with the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, Specialized Training Institute, and a founding member of the Human Trafficking Investigations and Training Institute. So we are thrilled to have you here, Ben. And with that, I would love to pass the baton over to you. Welcome.
That's awesome. Thank you, Jessica. I got to shorten that intro. That's just too many words. I don't know about all that. No, I want to thank you and your team for creating this space for this discussion, and then also props on the 50th webinar. Like that's an achievement, right? And you get really good participation. So not only is it 50 webinars, it's thousands of participants too. So good on you guys. Keep up the good work. We have a lot of people on this call today, and that's awesome. We're going to go for about a little under 2 hours. I'm going to give us all a break about halfway through, stretch our legs, just so you can kind of understand the flow of the agenda of the program. But I'm going to start here by sharing my screen. Everyone see my screen okay? All right. There we go. What are we going to talk about today for the next hour and 45 minutes or so? First, I want us to have a common operating picture of exactly what human trafficking is and what it's not. In specific discussion in how it impacts the tribal community, one of the things that I think is important to understand is jurisdictional issues when it comes to law enforcement and investigations. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're also going to talk about what we do know about how intimate partner violence and human trafficking impacts the tribal community disproportionately, and why some of those, why that may be occurring, specifically around the MMIW, missing and murdered Indigenous women and men in our tribal partners in their community. But we're also going to talk about the multidisciplinary approach and how it is crucial to have representation and inclusion of all of our community partners, and obviously this includes the topic of the day, our tribal partners as well. Again, thank you for that lead in, Jessica. I've been working in the human trafficking space since about 2009. I was a research attorney for the District Attorneys Association early on after I graduated law school. That was the start when California elevated human trafficking to a felony, was 2008, 2009. So from a legal perspective, it's a pretty fairly new felony in order to investigate, to understand the criminal tactics, and how to design a response system, which includes victim care, to address how the people are being victimized, and then ultimately holding the traffickers accountable. Like Jessica said, a few years ago, I joined Cal OES, Office of Emergency Services, technically in their training branch, but with my knowledge around trafficking, I also assist our human trafficking victims service grant programs in designing, scoring, and awarding service grants to NGOs and community-based organizations, as well as working with our intelligence analysts to better understand exactly how traffickers are exploiting systems in order to exploit victims, and how we can go about being smarter in our response and our training, and in designing our service programs. So that's a little bit about me. I want to start with a pretty simple but complex question. What is human trafficking? Can someone in the chat tell me what their definition of human trafficking is? What are some of our answers there, Jessica? What are we getting?
Yeah, I was just going to add, folks can post their answer in the chat. You can come off mute, but so far in the chat, modern day slavery,
Yeah.
person who is sold for sex or other illegal activity, enslaving humans for profit, force, fraud, or coercion. One person wrote, someone being taken by force or exploitation, forced labor, moving a person from town, city, states for money and or items, moving persons unwillingly for illegal activities, So there's quite a bit of different answers here.
I like it.
Exploitation. Yeah.
So I like it. So there's lots of ways that we have come to our common understanding or what we think human trafficking is. And obviously, media, television, movies play heavily into that. There's two ways we can define something. We can give something an inclusionary definition or an exclusionary definition. I can tell you what it is, or I can tell you what it is not. Okay. So first, I'm going to give you the definition of human trafficking that I would like you to take away by the end of this course. So when you're at the mailbox or you're at the grocery store and someone brings up the topic of human trafficking, this is the definition that I would like us to work off of today. It is the business of inducing a person to perform labor or engage in prostitution through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. I saw force, fraud, or coercion in the chat, right on. Those are all methods in order to gain compliance by your victim. It is the business of inducing. So it's a for profit or for gain. You need some type of monetary gain by the trafficker. And then again, you have a couple of different typologies, is what I would call it, either forced and exploited labor or commercial sex. So those are really, in my mind, the components that describe what human trafficking can be. It is the business of inducing a person to perform in labor or engage in commercial sex through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. What is trafficking not? Okay. If you've gone through some form of human trafficking 101 training before, you've probably seen some iteration of this side-by-side analysis. We do a really poor job of differentiating between human smuggling and human trafficking. And when I say we, I mean the government, both state and federal. These two things often get entwined, entangled, are used as synonyms when they're not. Politics are often wrapped around these two legal concepts. And so it is often either willfully confused or ignorantly confused. But let's untangle the two so that we have it straight in our discussion. Human smuggling is a willful action where a person crosses an international boundary without permission. Human trafficking does not at all require the crossing of any boundary whatsoever. Not an international boundary, not a state boundary, not a county or a city boundary. It is literally forcing someone to do something that they don't want to do. Smuggling, the aggrieved party, the party that's been harmed, is the nation state that had their sovereignty violated, their borders violated without permission. In trafficking, it's the individual that was forced to do something they didn't want to do, either forced physically or mentally coerced into doing something they didn't want to do. Like I had mentioned, for smuggling, it requires a border crossing. Trafficking does not. The smuggling within that relationship, technically, once the individual has crossed that border, they're free to go. There is no longer any type of control, direction, or control by the smuggler over that individual. Human trafficking is quite different. And I see a comment about minors' consent, and we're absolutely going to touch upon that here in a second when we analyze the AMP model. And the person who shared is absolutely correct in their comment. trafficking, there is this unhealthy relationship between the trafficker and the victim or survivor. And in this relationship, the trafficker is either physically forcing or coercing this person into doing things for the benefit of the trafficker. Now that may occur for a short period. It may occur for long periods of time, but there is no kind of natural end date to that exploitation like smuggling. And then again, smuggling, there's no labor or commercial sex that is a part of that component. It's literally crossing a border, and then that transaction, it really is a transaction, is complete. Second of all, just as a kind of a legal note, smuggling is only a federal crime because immigration issues are issues for Congress and not for each state to decide. At best, it's a misdemeanor if you look at the penalty structure, where human trafficking is both a state and a federal felony. And so they're two very, very different crimes. And often these two get commingled, and it makes the general public very confused as to what exactly trafficking is, what exactly smuggling is. Similar to what the person shared in the chat a second ago, we kind of categorize what I would call the elements of human trafficking into kind of a three-step process. And we call it the AMP model: the access, the means, and the purpose. In order for the action or access, we need some fact to demonstrate that the trafficker deprived or intended to violate the personal liberty of another person. And the means is, how did they do it? Is it the force, the fraud, or the coercion? And then for what purpose? Like we had mentioned, the purpose can either be commercial sex or forced and exploited labor. One thing that's interesting is, of the 4 border states, California and New Mexico have expanded their purpose. They've included extortion as a purpose for human trafficking. One of the gray areas that was very confusing for law enforcement and prosecutors was, and maybe you have heard this, well, can smuggling turn into human trafficking? Let's say I pay someone to smuggle me into the United States or any country, and then when I get there, the deal changes. And now I either have to do forced and exploited labor to pay off an erroneous debt or commercial sex. In my mind, it was always trafficking to begin with, and it was probably fraudulently induced trafficking, because the trafficker probably always intended there to be additional payment or services that needed before that person could, quote unquote, be free and go about their business. But to clarify, to kind of legally fill that confusion, California and New Mexico allow extortion. And what I just described to you exactly fits the legal definition of extortion. The model that you're looking at right now is the model we would use if the victim survivor is of majority age, 18 years or older. But if we're dealing with a minor, this is what the access or action, means, and purpose model would look like. And the person who shared a minute ago was correct, that minors cannot consent. They do not have the legal capacity to consent to a contract. So legally, why do I have to demonstrate that they were somehow tricked or forced or coerced into commercial sex? Now, this only applies to commercial sex. It does not apply to labor services, exploited labor. So if we have a minor and we're dealing with not commercial sexual exploitation, but exploited labor, we have to revert back to this model. So if it's a minor and we're dealing with labor, we legally still have to show some type of force, fraud, or coercion. Can anybody give me a reason why we find ourselves in this weird scenario? Because we say that minors can't form, they don't have the legal ability to form consent. But if we're dealing with labor or work, somehow we have to show they were tricked. Does anybody have any ideas on why that might be the case? And if you do, throw it in the chat. All right. Aralinda, 100% correct. Because minors can work at the age of 16. If all I have to show is somehow they were recruited or persuaded for a job and that they worked, and that is human trafficking, no 17-year-old could deliver pizzas, whether it was volitional or against their will. So because we allow minors to have gainful employment, we then have to show that that employment was actually against their will. Does that make sense to everybody? There are a lot of different characteristics and components that go into the relationship that a trafficker seeks in their victims. Traffickers are master manipulators. They exploit any vulnerability that they can find. And they are incredibly creative. And so when we look at our survivors, we see a myriad of different vulnerabilities. Generally, we talk about these within a push-pull factors analysis, which primarily is based off of years of research around migration and forced migration. But we see that a lot of these same components that drive migration is based off of systemic or structural vulnerabilities. Now, even though that a lot of the push-pull migration framework was built off of the crossing of international borders, there are personal characteristics. And so these same dynamics may be within the United States, and may be within the state of California. It may even be within your own city. Why does someone move from one part of the city to another part of the city? Some of the push factors, reasons that people would leave a particular area. No surprise, things like systemic poverty, sexual abuse and trauma, maybe in the home or in that community. Means of pure survival. There's no upward mobility in wherever that person is. They don't see any upward mobility or have access to any upward mobility. So they're looking for benefit elsewhere. Within that, you have systemic gender and racial discrimination and bias within systems that may force someone to seek opportunity elsewhere. Lack of resources, education. These are all areas where exploiters, if they can sense what that vulnerability is, they may offer these to that victim, but that comes with a price. And that usually is what the exploitation stems from.
Okay.
Great question, Michelle. Do individuals convicted of labor trafficking face the same legal penalties and prison sentences as those convicted of sex trafficking? The short answer is no. Our sentencing structure, even within commercial sex, is quite convoluted. Like I had mentioned, the legal concept of human trafficking is relatively new, 15, 16 years old. Exploitation's not. We know that's been going on for hundreds, thousands of years. Labor trafficking generally follows a kind of a 6, 8, 10 sentencing triad. So depending on the facts, the finder of fact or the judge may sentence somewhere in the 6, 8, 10 year time frame. For commercial sex, it's very, very different. There are a lot of legal components that may escalate the penalty. If we are talking about commercial sex of a minor, then that you can get, and it includes great bodily harm or GBH, that could escalate to 15 to life for the trafficker. Part of the problem we face is that when human trafficking was elevated in our penal code section, we didn't necessarily address it in all of the areas of our penal code system holistically. So we added it as a felony, and we added it as potentially 15 to life, but it was not added to a different penal code section that said all felonies are probation eligible. So technically, human trafficking is probation eligible. Well, then, of course, you're going to say, well, that's never going to happen. It happened twice last year in San Bernardino. Convicted of human trafficking because of the facts, the judge didn't find it to be that egregious, sentenced to time served and go down and get your probation officer. In that penal code section, the legislature there's a presumption that all crimes are probation eligible, unless otherwise stated. So there's a section that lists murder and rape and a bunch of other crimes that are not probation eligible. Human trafficking is not on that list. Part of the problem that I struggle with when we talk about statistics and data and trying to determine prevalence, of trafficking is a lot of people, a lot of decision makers, legislators will ask, well, how many convictions do we have for 236.1, our penal code section? And I'll say, I'll show them the data, and I was like, well, last year we had, 258. And they'll be like, well, that was a lot, but that's not like super bad. And then I say, well, wait a second. Are you asking me what is the prevalence of human trafficking? Because you're going to get a different answer. What if I told you the exact same set of facts that a prosecutor could charge for 236.1 human trafficking? Those same facts could also support pimping and pandering of a minor, but also get the sentence enhancement for in furtherance of a criminal street gang and conducted with a firearm. And under that scenario, they get 15 to life, and it's a strike, and it's guaranteed, and all kinds of no probation and all kinds of other penalty. It doesn't make it any less of a human trafficking case. It just gets diverted into a different penal code section. So it's very, very difficult to try to get our arms around prevalence because of some of these structural incongruities. I see a question from Mr. Yeager about the transportation of minors across state lines for immoral purposes. He must have been watching the Diddy case over the last few weeks. So I believe he's referring to what they call the Mann Act. The Mann Act has been around for about 90 years. Charles Mann was the senator who passed it. So yes, I believe the original, it's been modified over the last few years or last decades, but the original verbiage was that you cannot take a minor across state lines for immoral purposes or other debauchery, was the statutory language. Extremely subjective of what immoral purpose was. Because it was subjective, what it turned into was unequal and unfair prosecution of African Americans that were dating white women. And when they crossed state lines in the South, that then became the jurisdictional nexus for the FBI and the federal government to prosecute very famous people like Chuck Berry, the Rock and Roll Hall of Famer. Jack Johnson had his heavyweight title taken away from him and prosecuted. More recently, the laws have changed to be a little more specific. R. Kelly was convicted of the Mann Act a few years ago. And then, of course, most recently was Sean Combs and his trial, where he was acquitted on some counts, the racketeering accounts specifically, but then found guilty on other Mann Act related charges. So he is facing prison time, probably somewhere in the 2 to 10 years, and we'll know when he gets to the sentencing phase. There's also pull factors that go into this, not just push, but there's two reasons. There's a reason for you to leave a location, and then there's a reason to pick and go to a specific location. Going to a location is a pull factor. Getting away from a location is a push factor. And then, of course, I think these are all fairly rational and understandable reasons. A hope for a better life, whether it's education or work or a general better quality of living. And it's trying to achieve that self-actualization, the higher layers of Bloom's taxonomy of thinking and living, wanting a better life for your children. Those are just kind of high level 30,000 foot systemic analysis factors. But then if we drill down even farther, there may be certain characteristics that are unique to an individual. And you see there is some overlap when it comes to poverty, but especially if we're talking about marginalized segments of our community, whether it be the LGBTQ community, people with mental health issues, developmental challenges. These are all avenues that we have seen that traffickers will exploit. Traffickers are evil. They're not stupid. They will seek out and sometimes even create vulnerabilities in order to exploit an individual. A comment a second ago in the chat was about, if we're thinking about vulnerabilities, natural disasters instantly create vulnerabilities in large segments of our communities. And absolutely, this is an area that I've been researching recently and working with my agency, Cal OES, to how do we integrate or mitigate harm reduction when it comes to trafficking or exploitation post natural disaster. Because almost everything that we have talked about in the last 15, 20 minutes after a major hurricane, after a major earthquake, after the Palisades fires, or whatever, a major, all of those vulnerabilities are instantly present. And it's very hard for any one person or any one system to manage when you have that level of vulnerability basically overnight. So how do we have ways that we integrate mitigating or exacerbating harm. When we, in disaster response, when we evacuate an area, we have law enforcement posted to ensure that looting doesn't occur, because that we know in voids, that criminal element will seek to exploit. And again, more of some of so the last slide was individual, and then again, social factors that may create or exacerbate vulnerabilities. Systemic racism. We had a great example when we were talking about the Mann Act a second ago. And, sexualizing of young girls, young women, and even young men as well. Oh, think about over the past decade or so, a lot of the rightful scrutiny that like Abercrombie and Fitch get over their advertisements. So there's lots of areas that that can create vulnerability. It's incredibly challenging for us to harden or to build resiliency to fight off all these areas. The trafficker only needs to find one of them, but we have to find a way to support or mitigate all of the potential vulnerabilities, which is incredibly challenging. Now, if we bring this back to the community that we're talking about for today, think about how systemically, historically, our tribal partners or the tribal community has been treated, and how they have many of these vulnerabilities that are present in Indian country that traffickers may be able to exploit. And we're going to talk a little more about that as we progress through here. I can put up stats for days on the disproportionate impact of all crime to our tribal community. In particular, when we talk about sexual assault and sex-based crimes, the numbers are horrific. There's no other way to put it. 3, 5, 9 times more likely to be sexually assaulted for Native women than non-Native women. The question that I ask is, what is it about our system? What is it about our system that allows or is allowing this type of victimization to occur? There's a couple of different things that I want to discuss with the group. First off, it's only been relatively recently, I'm going to say the last 10 to 15 years, that a lot of these issues have started to be researched. So we're still relatively on the front end of the research window. So we're starting to understand that there's a problem, a big problem. We're starting to understand and get better at exactly what does the problem set look like, who exactly is impacted. For me, I want to get to that next step in the analysis as to where is the disconnect. So the previous administration had done a couple of things to start to bring the Native American community closer into, or having a seat at the table into the discussion on these issues. First and foremost, they've started to highlight some of the less represented or historically overlooked parts of our community, specifically around trafficking, the LGBTQ communities, and then I guess indigenous populations. For my vernacular, and if I'm incorrect, please correct me, but I tend to use indigenous peoples, First Nations, and Native Americans somewhat as a synonym. If that's not correct, please let me know. I've done a lot of work with our Canadian counterparts. They prefer indigenous population. It's a little different, but just so you know, I use those as synonyms, and if I'm not correct, please let me know. One of the things that the previous administration did is they had the first cabinet level secretary, Native American female for the Department of the Interior, and that was Deb Haaland. Now, one thing that a lot of people didn't realize, obviously she was the first cabinet level Native American, which in and of itself is groundbreaking. But also, because of the line of succession to the presidency, she was actually 9th in line to be president of the United States. And so that in and of itself, I think, is noteworthy. That we literally had, for the first time, someone from the Native population in line to be president of the United States. Let's talk about jurisdictional issues. I'm going to go for about 10 or so minutes, and then we'll take a little break and stretch our legs. When I was at the DOJ, there was an incident in the news where you had a well-known tribe in Central California that had a gaming facility. And there was a dispute over elected tribal council members. There was an ingoing and an outgoing tribal council, and there was a dispute around the vote and who was legitimate and who was not. It culminated with violence, including gunfire. Publicly in the news, the sheriff was asked, well, what are you doing to answer and follow up on this violence in this tribal land, in this in the Indian country? And that particular sheriff said, his words, not mine, that's a family issue. That's not his concern. That's for them to figure out. Let me explain to you why that sheriff was 100% wrong. There are 4 jurisdictions in the United States, 4 legal jurisdictions. A lot of times people don't understand some of the complexities around. So we have 4 distinct different legal systems. You have federal and state law, you have tribal law, and then you have the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UCMJ. And given the right set of facts, you may have a scenario that overlaps all 4 legal jurisdictions. And prosecuting that case in 4 different courtrooms And that's not double jeopardy under the US Constitution because they're all separate legal systems. You're not being held twice in jeopardy within the same legal system. So at first you would think, well, that's kind of like, that's never going to happen. It's like, well, I don't know. Do we have, is it out of the realm of possibility to think that we could have a scenario down somewhere in Southern California or San Diego where we have military personnel that committed a crime that was also on tribal land? That would be a scenario where all 4 legal jurisdictions could prosecute those crimes. So one criminal act, the defendant could have to appear in 4 different courtrooms, and each court system, each legal system has different remedies available to them. Obviously, state and federal law primarily is penal sentencing, prison time. Tribal law, there are some limitations under the Tribal Law and Order Act that was signed by President Obama, that you saw in that previous picture. And then, of course, the UCMJ, they have a lot of authority over remedies. They can take away your retirement. They can take away health care. They can take away all of those things to your family as well. So depending on the set of facts, there could be a really different, when we start to talk about tribal interaction, a whole new dynamic. And I see Alex, you got your hand raised. What do you got, sir?
Just quick question. So when you speak of that, I've seen this a couple of times when I worked in the prison system, and curious.
I'm sorry. Hold on one second. There was a little glitch. Could you start at the beginning for me, sir?
Oh, I said I've seen something like this. If I'm understanding it correctly, when I worked in a prison system, but I was curious, under what circumstances, like, or who takes charge, who takes lead? What is there? You know, let's say there's other community organizations around this. Who do they more or less report to, if you will?
Which law enforcement agency would take charge of the case? Is that your question?
Yeah, because you have so many different entities that are, you know, working on this, that who says this is a recommendation for, you know, services or whatever, you know, who has that overall final say?
So I'll turn the question around back to you. How do you think that conversation goes?
Who has the bigger stick? I don't know.
Yeah. Yes. The answer. So it comes down to resources first.
Okay.
First and foremost is resources. And then second, like many things in life, and I don't have to like it, but I have to recognize it. Is it a high profile case? Because if it becomes a high profile case, you have elected officials that want to be behind a podium. And so then it maybe becomes a federal case, and you have the US DOJ instead of the state DOJ.
So it really is
there's no rule on who goes first, who goes second, any of that stuff.
Okay.
I guess the closest thing to a rule I would say is there are some remedies that the victims have under the civil code, so they can sue civilly for damages. Those cases usually go after a criminal prosecution, because if in a civil case, if you were to call the defendant to testify, which you can do, and because in a civil case, you don't have a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. But if the criminal case is still active, the judge is not going to force them to answer questions. So the civil case is probably going to go second after all of the criminal justice system is completed. Did that kind of answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Yeah. It's very complex, and it gets very political very quickly. especially depending on the facts and if we're talking about celebrities or high-ranking officials or whatever the facts may be. I had mentioned earlier that California's penal code section is 236.1. It gets tweaked every year. It just is probably going to get changed here in the next week or two. Relatively small change. The bill that passed the House, the Assembly, and the Senate changes a small component of the commercial sexual exploitation of a minor. If the victim is 16 or 17 right now, it's considered a wobbler, meaning the prosecutor can charge it as a felony or a misdemeanor, depending on the set of facts and how the prosecutor wants to proceed. The law that will soon be sitting on the governor's desk will make it a straight felony and no longer a wobbler. So there's lots of little tweaks that are constantly occurring in this framework, but 236.1 is your operating code section. So let's take a quick break and let's take 5 minutes. When we come back from break, we're going to talk about jurisdiction that extends into Indian country. Okay. So let's take 5, turn your cameras off, rest your eyes, stretch your legs. I'll still be here, so if anybody has any questions, just pop on, but let's meet back at 10:07.
Juvenile justice kiddos, right? In custody and out of custody. And I'm just wondering, like, in general, when somebody is, like charged with like just anything under 236.1, like if they are a minor when they do commit, because I don't know, they were part of like the grooming process or just anything like that.
Yeah.
Does that change just kind of like, again, I'm assuming it does go back to the facts of the case, but the charge, like, does it change anything, like the sentence, stuff like that?
So in 2016, the California legislature modified our code section, and minors can no longer be charged with 236.1. It was a common criminal investigatory tactic to arrest everybody and charge everybody with a crime in order to get the victims to cooperate. But you can quickly see the hypocrisy if we are investigating, charging the trafficker for coercing the victim into doing something they didn't want to do, but law enforcement is doing the exact same thing. They're charging them with a crime to coerce them into cooperating in order to try to get the conviction of the trafficker. And so the legislature changed and made that tactic no longer legal. So what does that mean? That means that we need to get better as officers in building trust and rapport with our victims, and in order to have them want to cooperate rather than forcing them to cooperate. It's incredibly difficult. You may have cases where the officer wants to engage with the victim survivor, and that victim survivor, he or she may be, F you, get out of my face, I'm gonna, spit on you, whatever. We try to teach that officer, disengage, maybe come back in 5 or 10 minutes. Or, maybe if you think the reaction is because you're a male officer, maybe a female officer can assist. There's lots of other skills that we need to train and bolster in order to build that rapport, that trust in those victim survivors. But to my knowledge, that historical tactic of arresting everyone and charging everybody in order to get compliance, that's no longer legal.
Okay. And you said in 2026, right? That's when.
Sorry, 2016.
Oh, okay.
I may have said 2026. It was 2016 when that law went into effect.
Okay. So in general, somebody like a minor who is part of grooming, would they still be charged with something?
So that is a very fact specific, because now we're getting into the realm of forced criminality. So
Mhm,
let's say the trafficker had a favorite victim, let's say, within their group of victims. And that favorite, as long as, and I'm going to use the scenario where the trafficker is a male and the victims are female. Let's say if she helps keep the other girls in line, she gets treated better,
mhm,
less severe beatings, maybe gets to buy special clothing or better food, or whatever the benefit is.
Sure.
It becomes a very fine line as to when that person, are they still a victim, or at what point do they cross over to being a potential perpetrator? In
Mhm,
my mind, if they are only effectuating what the trafficker tells them to do, they are still in that victim classification.
right.
But if, because she's like the boss, if she's adding extra and
Mhm,
she's doing extra punishments and maybe skimming some money on the side or doing some additional victimization,
mhm.
now in my mind, you've started to cross over into perpetrator zone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like there's some sort of gain or actual interest in her.
Yes,
Mhm. Okay.
yes. But if
Okay.
she is just effectuating what the trafficker has told her to do,
Mhm.
that is coercion.
Right.
And I still very much would see and treat and have the system treat her or him as a victim.
Okay. Okay. That answers my question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Time's back. Jessica, you were gonna keep me on track, weren't you?
A little bit. I'm trying. I do see there were a few questions posted in the chat just as that conversation was happening. So I just wanted to lift that up.
What did I miss here?
Are there consequences for recruitment?
Potentially. And to kind of expand on what I had just mentioned to Veronica, a tactic that we have seen, and I don't know if I have enough information to say how prevalent it is, but it's a tactic we have seen where the trafficker will have a victim who was 100% dedicated to that trafficker. And that victim will intentionally get arrested and then try to recruit additional victims within the system.
Hmm.
So we call it in custody recruitment. Now, that from an evil perspective, that is, I know where my vulnerable population are. They're in custody. So I'm going to send my agent in to go get more victims. So that is important. I don't want us to I don't want us to be jaded to think that, oh, this victim is just here because they want to recruit, but I want us to be aware that that is a potential within the system. I still want us to respond with care and support, victim-centered approach with trauma-informed care on all of these survivors. But also in the back of your mind, understand that there may be a different plan in action. Innocence Lost task forces, do they still exist across the country? Yes and no. So many of the federally funded task forces come and go based off of funding. They're usually on 12, 18, or 24-month funding cycles. And so I am constantly trying to track which task forces are still in operation, and which ones have shuttered due to lack of funding. The Sacramento one, the Innocence Lost Task Force, has come and gone over the past 10, 15 years. I think they just reconstituted it, so I think it's going to be around in the Sacramento area for at least another year, maybe 2 years. But so a large question, yes, they're still around. Are they in the same locations? Maybe, maybe not. Any other questions before we talk about PL 280? All right. Who can tell me what PL 280 is? In the chat. I mean, you kind of have a side-by-side comparison there in front of you, but who can kind of succinctly give me a definition of what it is and what it does? Oh, and I forgot to tell you guys, I went to law school, so I like to call on people if I don't get participation in the chat. So Felicia's like, I'm stepping away. I'll be right back. Veronica, have you ever heard of PL 280?
I have not, but based on what's on the screen, I'm assuming it refers to when law enforcement is able to step in, on tribal land for like criminal or just civil activity, I guess. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. So in the late 1940s, 1950s, before then, any criminal activity on tribal land, and to be legally correct, it is federal land held in trust for the tribal nation. So the tribes have great sovereignty over a lot of the activities and their people on the land, but the land itself is technically owned by the US government. Because that was the case, law enforcement was the duty and obligation of the US government, which is the US DOJ and the FBI. Now, there were a lot of problems with that. There is a massive amount of tribal land across the United States, particularly in the Western states. The FBI, they weren't going to go out there and patrol. They weren't going to respond to calls, and they weren't. And so you had these, in essence, lawless areas that law enforcement was not responding to. So what Public Law 280 did is, and the numbers of states have grown over the years, but initially there was 15, 16, 17 states that the federal government gave the state law enforcement, either local or the state DOJ, the duties and obligations of enforcing state criminal code in Indian country. So now it's the sheriff's duty for a lot of these areas, because a lot of the tribal land is a little more rural and unincorporated areas. Not all of it, but the majority of it. So the sheriffs are like, okay, cool. So now I have all this new area that I need to patrol and respond to. So how much money is the federal government gonna kick down because we have all this new area that we have to respond to? And the federal government just kind of laughed and said, oh, that's cute. You think you're gonna get funding. No, you just have all the duties and obligations. And so what did the sheriffs do? The sheriffs were like, okay, well then we just won't go out there. And so then they maintained lawless and de facto havens for all types of criminal activity. And a lot of the criminal activity, it didn't even necessarily originate with the indigenous people of that land. It can be criminal actors that come from the city, but then they go out to the tribal land because they know law enforcement's not going to respond to that area. Remember, the traffickers and the criminals, they're evil. They're not stupid. They're going to go where they think they can operate with impunity. Now, we're only talking about criminal law. Environmental laws, all types of other laws, the tribes still enjoy great levels of sovereignty, especially around the cultivation or harvesting of wildlife, whether it be fishing or hunting rights. All those types of things are separate. But when it comes to 236.1, human trafficking, there is no debate that 236.1 applies equally in Indian country, and it is the duty and obligation of whatever law enforcement jurisdiction, probably the sheriff, to investigate and prosecute those cases. What was frustrating from the story that I had mentioned previously in the Central Valley was the sheriff there was like, he either didn't know the law, he was either ignorant of the law or willful ignorance, and he said, that's a criminal, that's a family issue, that's not me. No, that's you. That is 100% you. And when you are not responding, you are not protecting those residents of California, those populations in those areas. Now, I mean, the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota is a little different because they came on later. They weren't one of the first mandatory PL-280s. So you have mandatory PL-280 states, you have voluntary PL-280 states, and then you have modified PL-280 states. And then you have non-PL-280 states. So tribal jurisdiction is incredibly complex when you get outside of California. California is pretty simple for the most part. You get into like Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, parts of Arizona, it gets really messy, really legally messy. And of course, traffickers, they thrive in confusion, right? When we don't know what we're doing, they're winning. We talked about this. Oh, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. That's why. There we go. Here's a list of some of the states that are PL 280. At last count, I believe California has 119 or 122 federally recognized tribes.
109.
107, thank you. It fluctuates, and I think we have 1 or 2 state recognized tribes. Somewhere in that range. In comparison, Arizona has 4 federally recognized tribes. So we have one of the largest states with indigenous population of the union. Okay. All right, Alaska, 200. California has about 33 or 34 human trafficking task forces across the state. The nomenclature is a little messy. So sometimes they are task forces, community working groups, community collaboratives. There's no mandatory nomenclature, so it's a little messy. But just a few years ago, we were at 15. And we're now on our way to 50. A lot of these task forces they absolutely intersect with Indian country across our state, because you saw the kind of historical pre-contact territories of the tribes. To my knowledge, and this is a massive gap in oversight, none of these task forces have tribal representation in any of these task forces. The areas of responsibility, the AORs for each task force, one of the questions was, does the Sacramento task force cover Yuba and Sutter area? I don't know. I'm in the process right now of trying to understand where the AORs are for each one of these task forces, so I can try to figure out where the gaps are in our response system. But so I don't know exactly where the lines are drawn. You can see just a simple, just eyeball test. Task forces are primarily located on high population, high density locations. Sacramento, Bay Area, LA, San Diego, Fresno, Bakersfield. That leaves the rural areas where much of the Indian country may lie, technically unprotected unless those task forces also respond to those areas. All right, so let me ask you this. So it doesn't apply in California because 236.1 applies equally in Indian country. And Jessica, I don't know, I think we're getting, we have some blue lines on our screen here. I think we have some, I love the doodles, don't get me wrong. I love the doodling. I'm not sure if everyone else sees the doodles. I'm not sure how to clean that up. So I'm just gonna.
It might be
work
the
through it.
annotation. The annotation setting is on. But we can, Alicia, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Ben, when you hover over your screen, if you see the little pencil button at the left-hand corner at the bottom, can you click on that? And then, because you're sharing your screen, if you click on that, you can erase. There's a little eraser to erase.
It's blacked, it's grayed out.
Okay,
My
how about closing your screen and not sharing and then sharing back on? But it's still on your screen. Let's see. Let's try it again. Yeah, let's see if you can reshare your screen.
And if it's still there, we can share the PowerPoint on our end and move the slides for you, Ben, if that's helpful. Just let us know.
Yeah,
Okay,
that
cool.
worked.
Thank you for that, guys. One of the things that I've found, especially in the non-PL 280 states, we talked about the 4 jurisdictions. If criminal activity occurs on tribal land, one of either the perpetrator or the victim needs to be non-native in order for the US DOJ to have jurisdiction. Well, then that begs the question, what happens if the perpetrator and the victim are both native? Only tribal law applies in non-PL 280 states. Well, how many tribes have a human trafficking code section? There is no centralized database for tribal laws that I'm aware of. I've contacted numerous high-level tribal partners. Like for me, state or federal law, I can go to Westlaw or Lexis and I can look up various states' laws. There is no clearinghouse for tribal law. I have only been able to locate like 5. And here are a couple of the tribal laws that I was able to locate. Now, one of the things that I actually appreciate about that could be very empowering in creating agency within these tribes is because they can create their own law, their own tribal law, they get to frame the issue as they see it affecting their community. it's not Congress or it's not the state legislature dictating parts of the penalties or what aspect of the criminal activity that they want to focus on. The statutes that you're going to see are primarily commercial sexual exploitation of a minor. So this particular tribe here is from Arizona. Under the Tribal Law and Order Act, tribes are limited to no more than either 2 or 3 year penalty for any crime. So even murder, under tribal law, the max penalty is 2 or 3 years. Before President Obama signed the Tribal Law and Order Act, it was only 1 to 2 years. So their authority is somewhat limited, but there is still the authority for them to exercise control and agency over some of their territory. Here's one from Washington State. Again, it is sexual exploitation of a minor. And remember of that larger, discussion of what human trafficking is. These statutes do not address forced and exploited labor, and generally they don't address exploitation of someone of majority age. It really is of minors. Another one in Washington State. This one's a little broader. This one has a subsection, but for under the age of 18. I haven't done the math on how many tribes are in non-PL 280 states. But I would assume it's still in the hundreds. And if I can only find a handful of tribal laws that apply, or only a handful of tribal laws on this point, technically that means that in non-PL 280 states, if the victim and the trafficker were both native, it would not be a crime. Because federal jurisdiction doesn't apply, state jurisdiction doesn't apply, and the tribe has not made that activity a crime. Any questions on that point? I just gave you like 12 years of legal analysis, like in 5 slides. So it's incredibly complex to understand the intertwining of state, federal, and tribal law. All right, so we kind of talked about a lot of these things just generally, but I think all of us on this call knows that our tribal partners suffer at greater statistics than average on many of these subpoints. One area that I know some tribal communities, some tribes recognize is the presence of people that are two-spirited. Is that something that, because I know we have, I think, what, four tribal representatives on the call today. Is this something that your people, that your tribes recognize? Instead of like being gay or lesbian, transgendered, the two-spirit concept? Does anybody want to share? What are some of the barriers do you think the tribal community, and again, put your answers in the chat. What are some of the barriers that the tribal community faces in this issue when it comes to either identifying perpetrators or educating vulnerable populations? What are some of the barriers? Okay, education, cultural practices. Resources is always a barrier. I don't care what we're doing, but absolutely it is. Language, I like that, language. And when we talk about language, I would even expand that in a little bit larger context, is how to communicate. How to effectively communicate some of these ideas and concepts. Yes, small knit communities at times make it very difficult to identify perpetrators. Trust is huge. Trust is huge. So building trust and rapport and information sharing was the topic of my master's thesis. And especially when you're dealing with a section of our community that has very legitimate historical grievances with state and federal government, that has to be addressed. And I'm not saying come to a solution, but when I talk to officers and we're looking for ways to build trust, just even verbally acknowledging that point, that I understand in the past, in 1850, California had laws on the books that it was legal for whites to go into Indian country and take their children and sell them on the streets of San Francisco. And if parents fought back, it was legal for whites to kill the parents. It was legal for farmers to go into Indian country or find vagrants on the street, pick them up. The farmer would pay the bail, and then they had to work in the fields to work off their bail money, almost like indentured servitude, where they would be put back on the street and picked up as vagrants again. Acknowledging the harm that has been done in the past. Not that you're showing up with all the answers, but just simply acknowledging that you're aware of what history tells us is a great first step into building trust, in my mind. Let's see, what else? Yes, lacking forensic resources, huge. Like, especially if we're talking about sexual assault, you know, that you need forensic kits, you need resources in order to collect and maintain the evidence of the crime. If you don't even have those SART kits and things along those lines, you don't even have a starting point for an investigation. Protection-wise, it's a little different in California, like I said, because of PL 280. However, there are, I don't know, a dozen or 24 tribes that have tribal law enforcement. Many of them, most of them are cross deputized, I believe, for jurisdictional purposes. However, in my research, in my discussions with a number of the tribes, what do you think their primary focus is when a tribe sets up tribal law enforcement? Anybody? Jade, I see you leaning in. You got any thoughts on this?
What's the focus of the tribal law enforcement?
Yeah. What do you think what would be one of some of their primary concerns for tribal law enforcement?
maybe I'm not super, I mean, I think the focus, I see them working a lot with like domestic violence and things like that. But,
Okay.
I think some of the concerns for the police force themselves is covering really large areas with really limited resources
Yeah.
and having response times that are appropriate to support the people when they need it, and concerns with confidentiality and
Yeah.
lots of things.
So when you have large areas to respond to with limited resources, you prioritize your calls. And I'm not saying this is how all tribal law enforcement, but often the gaming locations become priority because that is massive revenue for the tribe. Now, technically, the sheriff should be responding. So it's not that they're necessarily leaving an area unprotected, because that area should be protected anyway by the sheriff. But then you start to overlay intra-tribal politics within their law enforcement response systems. So protection can get a little tricky. Culturally responsive care. I spend a lot of time simply educating officers on different parts of life or different parts of the world they didn't know about in various aspects of law enforcement. Some of the other classes I do for Cal OES, I talk about, we do counterterrorism. We do 5 hours on the history of Islam. I would love to see much more bandwidth given to areas just for pure education. Because I think when you understand people, or at least a little bit of their history, you're in a better position to have a simple conversation. There's only a handful of reports out there that are, in my mind, comprehensive reports. You might find human trafficking reports that mention or have a small segment when we're talking about Native or Indigenous populations, but I'm going to share 2 with you that are primarily focused out of Minnesota. Professor Deere there from, I think, University of Minnesota, did a fairly in-depth study and research of the victimization of Native women and sexual assault and trafficking. Again, the numbers are ridiculous. I can read the numbers to you, but I mean, there was a vignette that stood out to me. One of the things that I want prosecutors and law enforcement, we need to get smarter and more creative to match the traffickers. And what do I mean by that? The traffickers are kind of like, I use the analogy, they're kind of like bomb makers. They're only limited by their resources and their imagination. And I want our prosecutors and law enforcement to be that creative as well. So I read this vignette of a victim. I don't know if she was a minor or not. It doesn't really matter for the story, but her trafficker was a white male and was advertising her online as Pocahontas. And the buyer of sex could role play as John Smith conquering the West. Now, in my mind, I mean, obviously we have trafficking, but as I read that, I saw that also as a weaponization or victimization of that person's culture. And so usually when I have a crazy idea, I call one of my mentors and say, hey, I have this crazy idea. Tell me if I'm stupid. And so I said, well, why wouldn't this qualify as a hate crime enhancement? So technically the hate crime enhancement, it doesn't use the word hate in the statute. It's a bias motivated crime. And usually we think of bias in the negative. I don't like African Americans, so I'm going to bomb an African American church. That historically has been how we have utilized that enhancement. But bias just means you have a proclivity towards a particular person. It is motivation neutral. So my argument would be, and this is where I want our prosecutors to be creative, to hold people fully accountable. This trafficker had a business model. And this trafficker had a business model that they needed to fulfill a specific set of victim to meet the business model. Now, whether that victim was Native or not, they needed to be able to sell that victim as Native. And so where maybe you could get 10 to 15 years for human trafficking, if you're able to enhance it with a hate crime or a bias motivated crime enhancement, that puts an additional 10 or 20 years on top of it. This is where I want our criminal justice system to get to. We need to match their level of creativity. The trafficker, the exploiters are ahead of us. They are finding vulnerabilities in the system. They are finding or creating vulnerabilities in their victim class. So I want us to push back as hard as they are pushing. Any questions on that point? What really hurts is not only the level of victimization of the indigenous populations in these areas, but I mean, you guys have said it 50 times in the chat. There's not even the resources to support them once we identify them. So not only are the numbers off the charts, we're not even positioned to help the ones we do identify. That's a systemic failure on our decision makers, our directors of agencies and our policymakers, our legislators, of not funding these programs at appropriate levels. The outcome of that trafficker, it was not clear in the report from that Minnesota report what the outcome was. It was more focused on the trauma and the victimization of the survivor. It was less focused on the outcome of the case. I don't even know if there was a criminal case that was put forward. So it was kind of an anecdotal story from the survivor of what she went through. And again, cultural abuse. I'm willing to bet if we were smarter and better at capturing the experience of the survivor, we would probably find more and more of this. Maybe not that exact scenario, but other scenarios where traffickers are leveraging culture, they are leveraging their community status and their history in order to gain compliance. I'm still looking for that creative, forward-leaning prosecutor that's ready to lean into this and not be afraid if they make a mistake and the conviction's overturned. Sometimes we got to lean into this and not be afraid of making a mistake to start to find some of the solutions. We got about 10 or so minutes left, so I'm going to kind of talk a little quicker through some of these components.
And
Again,
really
this was
quick,
the topic of, yeah.
yeah, sorry, Ben, just really quick, in our last 10 minutes together, I'm going to go ahead and drop our evaluation poll for our audience to complete as we are finishing up with the presentation. So you can feel free to go ahead and keep going for the remainder of the time. But for the folks in the audience, please, please, please take a moment to fill out our evaluation as well. Thanks, Ben.
Perfect. I appreciate that. Thank you. Like I said, collaboration was the focus of my master's, and coordination, cooperation, and collaboration are three very different types of group work, and we often use them as synonyms. And all the time I get frustrated with my bosses because they think collaboration is a geographic setting. If I sit next to somebody, we're going to collaborate. Proximity has nothing to do with collaboration. Collaboration is a conceptual way to work together. That can be done in the same city. That could be done in different time zones. That can be done in different dimensions if we have different dimensions. It is not a geographic location. That being said, there are some things that can be done to move us from the left side of this graph to the right side of the graph. Coordination is where we spend most of our time when we work as a group. Sometimes we get to cooperation, which is good. Very rarely do we ever truly get to true collaboration. That is where you are working in a symbiotic relationship, and you have let go of your goals. The other person has let go of their initial goals, and you have created a mutually designed goal together. Very hard to do for a whole bunch of different reasons. So this is what the federally funded task force map looks like. And it changes over the years. And yes, this map is a couple years old because the federal government has not updated with a newer one. About 55 federally funded task forces across the United States. A lot of those are either located in or near tribal land. Again, to my knowledge, none of these have any tribal representation in their task force formation. Riverside County is going to be standing up a new fusion center. An Intel Fusion Center is where they collect and analyze criminal intelligence. And I've been told that they are going to have a tribal representative or some type of tribal footprint, some type of tribal representation in the Fusion Center. And so I'm really looking forward to having those partners in our intel collection and analysis sphere. Because I think it's going to bring a new dynamic, a new discussion to a lot of these issues when we talk about California and how it's impacting the people that reside here. There was a fair amount of discussion around MMIW over the past 5 or 10 years. I don't know how the current administration is going to continue many of these programs. I don't know at what levels the programs that were previously funded under the previous administration are going to continue or not. But that being said, there are things that we can do here in California that are outside of whatever the federal decisions are made. So I have a little video here. It's a couple minutes about some of the impact of murdered, missing Indigenous women and men.
The stories of American Indians
You
and
guys hear the
Alaska
audio,
Natives
okay?
are as varied and nuanced as the people themselves. But the latest study from the National Institute of Justice finds one troubling through line that links these stories: the experience of high rates of violence. Like songs and oral histories, science can raise awareness by quantifying the severity of violence. It's time to hear what the numbers are saying. The vast majority of American Indian and Alaska Native women and men have experienced violence in their lifetime, and 1 in 3 have experienced recent violence in the past year. Those levels are higher than the general population, but that's not where the inequalities end. The study also measures a range of impacts as well as services needed because of violence. What's behind those numbers? Let's start with the finding that for American Indians and Alaska Natives, violence doesn't discriminate by gender. Women and men share similar rates of victimization. That means almost 3 million American Indian and Alaska Native women and men have been victims of violence. To put that number in perspective, imagine if everyone in the state of Iowa stood up, or every resident of Orlando, Dallas, Detroit, Anchorage, and Atlanta combined. That's the scale of the violence, but what about the scope? The NIJ study breaks types of violence into 4 categories, and violence against American Indians and Alaska Natives is high across all of them. Take stalking, for example. It can be a gateway to more aggressive violence, and repeated, unwanted, fear-inducing experiences come in many forms. Lifetime estimates of stalking for women in the study are almost double those of non-Hispanic whites. Add male and female victims together, and that's more than 1.2 million people. That would fill 20 sports stadiums if every single ticket holder had been stalked. Being forced or coerced to engage in unwanted sexual activity is another form of violence, a form all too familiar to American Indians and Alaska Natives. For example, these mothers, daughters, and sisters face almost 2 times the risk of sexual violence with penetration as non-Hispanic white women. Overall rates of physical violence by intimate partners in the past or present are even higher, from being shoved to having a gun or knife used on them. More than 1 in every 2 women and more than 1 in every 3 men have experienced physical violence by intimate partners in their lifetimes, comparatively much higher than the physical victimization rates over the lifetimes of non-Hispanic whites. Of course, not all violence is sexual or physical, so the NIJ study also examines psychological aggression. For example, expressions of anger that seem dangerous or humiliating, or controlling access to birth control. Overall, psychological aggression affects more than 1 in every 2 women and men. Psychological aggression may not be as obvious as broken bones or bruises, but it is real. Among victims, 63% of women report partners tracking them, and 55% of women report being kept from family or friends. These are just a few findings, but remember, they are numbers that correspond to real victims who would feel the entire state of Iowa. Now picture if 97% of women and 90% of men in Iowa were victimized by people of other races and ethnicities, interracial perpetrators who violated the safety of their schools, workplaces, parks, homes, and bedrooms. Numbers alone don't tell the whole story, but they do point to a dangerous gap. Most federally recognized tribes don't have the legal authority to criminally prosecute non-Indians, even for crimes committed on tribal lands. So, what does it all mean? The impacts of high rates of violence against American Indians and Alaska Natives range from missed days of work or school to physical injuries. It's not surprising that services are needed, like medical care to treat injuries. But here's where the NIJ results uncover another glaring disparity. Almost 40% of female victims who need services can't get them, compared with only 15% of non-Hispanic white female victims who fall through the cracks. American Indians and Alaska Natives deserve better, and now there is science to prove it. These numbers are not abstract. They bear witness to real people: mothers, girlfriends, brothers, and grandfathers. Our hope is that this study will lead to a story of a new beginning, one where all of us listen to what the science is saying, what the victims are saying, and unite to prevent violence wherever it happens.
I'm really hoping that a number of the programs the last administration started continue, because I think there's a lot of progress that still needs to be made. I know we're getting close to the end of our time here, and I see there's some people, and I understand time limitations. I'm going to put my email into the chat, and please, if anybody has any questions or anything follow up, I'm happy to answer any questions. I mean, you guys have been awesome. I've kept you your full time. I wish I had more time because I'm an attorney. I can talk forever. So if you guys have any questions, I'm going to hang out here for a little longer. You guys have been great. Jessica?
Pardon me. Thank you so much, Ben. This has been a really wonderful presentation. The folks in the audience seem to really enjoy it and benefit from it. You did receive a lot of appreciations in the chat as folks were heading out to their next meeting. Thank you so much for the information you provided today. We definitely look forward to having you back next month in August. And for everyone in the audience still left on this call, thank you for being here with us today, sharing your Wednesday morning with us. We greatly appreciate your presence and your participation, as well as your valuable feedback. So I hope you all get out there and get to enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. And we look forward to seeing you back here next month. Take care, everyone. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.